afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Jen Bender with the Build Initiative, and I'll be handling the logistics on today's call. Audio for today's webinar will be broadcast through your computer speakers. Please ensure your speakers are turned to a comfortable volume. If you have any questions or comments throughout the session, please type them into the chat box. Please note that other participants will not see your questions and comments in the chat box, so the presenters will monitor the chat and provide responses as they are able. This webinar will be recorded. Following the conclusion of today's webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the webinar recording and the PowerPoint. I'm now going to turn it over to Angelica.
Thank you, Jen. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Place, Race, ACE, and the First 1,000 Days, New Imperatives in Early Childhood. We have an impressive number of people registered for this webinar. This really speaks to the continuing recognition of how important the early years are for young children. My name is Angelica Cardenas Chezon, and I'm with the Child and Family Policy Center. I'm also a staff person for the Learning Collaborative on Health Equity in Young Children. We have three great speakers today representing three wonderful organizations who are working on this issue at all levels. First, you will hear from Charlie Bruner, who is with the Learning Collaborative on Health Equity in Young Children in the Child and Family Policy Center. The Learning Collaborative on Health Equity is a partnership between the Build Initiative and the Child and Family Policy Center, and funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation as part of its building of community health. Our second speaker today is Richard Chase, who is Senior Research Manager at the Wilder Research. The Wilder Research is part of the Amherst H. Wilder Foundation. The Wilder Research gathers and interprets facts and trends to help families and communities thrive, get at the core of community concerns, and uncover the issues that are overlooked or poorly understood. Our third and final speaker will be Bharti Wari, Executive Director of the Children's Defense Fund, Minnesota, Voices and part of the Voices and Choices Coalition in Minnesota. Bharti will talk more in detail of the Voices and Choices Coalition, so I will not go into much detail except to say that the Voices and Choices Coalition power and ability to address this issue is really based on the partners that come to the table. Once we finish with the formal presentation, we hope to have time to answer questions you may have. So we will be looking at the chat box. So why don't we get started? So I will begin by really sharing some points that will be covered in our discussion today. The first point is we'll be discussing the importance of the first 1,000 days. Secondly, the importance of place and race. Thirdly, the emerging political recognition of the need for the new responses. And the final point is a blueprint for state policy and really looking at Minnesota. So why don't I go ahead and turn it over to our first speaker, Charlie Bruner.
Thank you, Angelica. And I'm going to cover the first 3 points, which really make the case and provide some of the background and information for the exciting work that is underway in Minnesota to really put into policy and practice what we do know about early childhood, the first 1,000 days, race, place, and the need to create new responses to strengthen and support families in the context of their communities, neighborhoods, and cultures. So I'm going to go over these first 3 points and then turn it over to the folks from Minnesota to explain their report and their work and recommendations for action in Minnesota. And a lot of what I'm saying probably won't be new to you, but I hope that it does help to frame the discussion in a meaningful way that can be used with colleagues to point toward activities. And the first thing is that we're talking about the first 1,000 days, and a lot of people, when they look at early childhood as being the birth to 5 years, but then a lot of the information and the work is focused on preschool, child care, and child development activities. And this slide really says the first 1,000 days are tremendously important in a child's life, but it's so much about bonding and attachment with parents and immediate one-on-one caregiving that kids are learning through serve and return activities. As you get into the second 1,000 days, it's a lot about socialization and learning in groups and more intentional learning environments. But in the first 1,000 days, really the intimacy and the critical nature of how we can support and sustain families is paramount. I'm having just a little trouble.
Do you want me to do it for you?
And what we know from the science on the critical needs for positive health trajectories in the first 1,000 days is really that this is a time when a child's sense of attachment, learning, and first developments of reading and connections with others occurs. There's really a broad scientific literature that comes from a variety of different worlds, from the medical world, from the clinical research world, from the social world. There's the protective factors work. There's the adverse childhood experiences research. There's the resiliency work, epigenetics, neurobiology. There's the Center on the Developing Child talking around the importance of ensuring that stresses that occur in the early childhood do not become persistent and prevailing and toxic stress, and their social determinants of health. And when you look at all of those sciences, what they do really spell out as parents, and they really all emphasize that, particularly in those first 1,000 days, the first outcome, the foundational outcome for child's growth and development and life course health is really the safety, stability, and nurturing in the home environment. And in fact, whatever policy question people may be raising, what can we do to end poverty or chronic disease or school dropout or ensure the next generation is equipped with the skills needed for the future, how we deal with delinquency and crime, or how we can eliminate disparities and inequities. Not the whole answer, but a significant part of the social policy answer is to make investments in the first 1,000 days that will, in fact, get kids off to a strong start in life in a safe, stable, and nurturing home environment. So the second point that we make is that in addressing these needs, we really have to look at the importance of race, place, and poverty and how they impact children's healthy development. And poverty affects material well-being and can certainly produce life-threatening and health-threatening absences of concrete services and make it, and really be life-threatening. But it also affects the relative status and opportunity for growth in society. There's both absolute and relative poverty, and we know that poverty is greatest among young children and has implications on all aspects of their healthy growth and development. We also know that young children of color are much more likely than white children to experience poverty, and they and their families are more likely to experience social and structural discrimination, exclusion, and marginalism that are hazardous to future healthy development, which also includes geographic segregation. Clearly, that discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization also produces that limited means and greater likelihood of poverty. And in terms of young children and poverty, this slide shows that young children are the age group that is most likely to live in poverty in our country. 1 in 4 kids, 0 to 5, lives at or below the poverty level, and almost half live in households that make less than 200% of the poverty level, which is basically meaning that they're struggling simply to make ends meet. And compare that with only 9.4% of seniors. Since the War on Poverty in 1964, we've done a lot to reduce poverty among seniors and some among other populations, but we really haven't done the job in terms of addressing child poverty. And when you look at the distribution of child poverty, children of color are by far the most economically disadvantaged. And this slide shows that while 16% of white non-Hispanic kids are in poverty, more than twice that rate of Hispanic children and African American children are. And fully 2/3 to 3/4 of Hispanic and African American children are living in households which are making less than 200% of poverty, where really the norm and the expectation is that you're struggling to get by and you're probably having a challenge to getting ahead. In the first 1,000 days of life, we also talk roughly as being the first 3 years of life. So we know that young children disproportionately live in places with high child poverty, and that place is particularly important for young children. Because where they live affects what they see, and this is the time of year where they're most tied to their immediate home environment. And we know from our research too that the poorest neighborhoods in our country are also those that are the wealthiest in terms of young children. And if there are census tracts with 0 to 10% poverty have about 5.9% of their population being young children, but in census tracts with 40% or over of poverty, it's more than 8% of all the population is young children. That means those poor neighborhoods need half again as many child and family-friendly gathering points, activities, supports, and the types of both social and physical capital that are necessary just for kids to be able to explore their world. And we also know that those neighborhoods are highly segregated. When we look at those neighborhoods which are over 50% child poverty, it's about 82% children of color, compared with neighborhoods which have less than 10% poverty, which are about 67% white non-Hispanic and 33% children of color. So while 8% of all white non-Hispanic kids live in census tracts where the poverty rate is above 40%, 40% of African Americans, 32% of Native Americans, and nearly 30% of Hispanics do. That if we're going to do something to support young children in their healthy development, we have to look at their neighborhoods as well as their own family economic condition. And this just shows some comparisons among neighborhoods which are high poverty neighborhoods versus the poorest neighborhoods versus the least poor. And on almost any of these dimensions except families with wage income, that families are still working, they're just not making very much, that there are real differences in what is available in the neighborhood and the community. And this really does imply that if we're going to do something to support families in those neighborhoods, we have to make those neighborhoods supportive to those kids. As I said, they're going to need more family-friendly gathering places. Their families are going to need more opportunities for connecting up with others, that there need to be as much or more social capital and ties. So a focus on neighborhoods and community building is one aspect of our work if we're going to be responding to children. It goes well beyond just service strategies. From our work in neighborhoods, and Richard may want to talk a little bit more, we know that families want their children to have opportunities for success in the larger society and will make a lot of sacrifices, take a lot of actions to that end if they have pathways to get there. We also know those neighborhoods really have that less social, recreational, physical capital, as well as less economic and educational capital. And we know that building those pathways is possible, but it does involve additional and different types of investments that are best done by engaging and enlisting those in the communities themselves and providing and supporting leadership that is linguistically and culturally responsive and and diverse itself. So that kind of lays out why we think race, place, poverty, young children intersect, and we need to make new and more investments in this particular environment. Fortunately, I think that there is emerging recognition that this does need to occur, and that there are opportunities even in a partisan political environment to do this work. Frankly, left and right scholarship agree. Robert Putnam's Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, and Charles Murray's Coming Apart, The State of White America had remarkably similar views about the challenges to American families that were the result of increased geographic segregation into upper and lower class families, and the different opportunities that exist, and both really did emphasize that place and social capital matter. They may not have agreed on a lot of things, but these are two quotes that are taken from their acceptance speeches, where they chose to make these statements in terms of their accepting their nominations for their presidency, and both of them speak to the need to invest in kids, the need to look at a neighborhood or a community level to do so, and the need to assure equity and equality of access. And a recent report from the American Enterprise Institute and Brookings Institution, a working group on poverty and opportunity, which included those from both the left and the right, working to develop a consensus statement on how we can reduce poverty and restore the American dream, came up with the same recommendations around we need to strengthen families in ways that will prepare children for success. And one of their aspects is using primary pediatric and preventive care to mount evidence-based parenting programs. But as they said at the top, they drew upon the brain research and the parent science to say that this is one of the keys for our future prosperity of our society and for reducing poverty. And similarly, in a very similar statement with very similar recommendations, the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Community Pediatrics, which looked at child poverty, came up with the same sets of recommendations. So those all show that there is at least emerging interest across the political spectrum on doing something to strengthen families and to support child development in the earliest learning years. Robert Putnam speaks to purple solutions to child poverty and equity of opportunity, and I do think that in this respect the Democrats have generally spoken to the material and structural side of this work, expanding the minimum wage, equal pay, paid family leave, high-quality child care, and college education affordability. Republicans have more spoken to the spiritual and community side, the need for personal initiative and responsibility, coupled with opportunities within neighborhoods and communities, the engagement of faith-based communities and development of faith-based strategies and voluntary as well as professional services, and investments in indigenous leadership in those neighborhoods. And in fact, I think what I have tried to present here, and I think what will come forward as you hear from the folks from Minnesota, is that they're really proposing strategies that are purple in character and are really getting at doing both. So I want to just conclude that I think the implication for early childhood system builders is, one is health systems leadership. We're not going to talk a lot about this here, but slides at the end of this deck, which you'll get after this presentation, speak to the role that the primary health practitioner can play as a first contact with young children and families to link them to community resources. This family strengthening focus, providing preventive two-generational approaches to support and strengthen parenting, and then this emphasis upon social capital to connect with and enhance informal and community supports within the neighborhoods and communities that really provide opportunities for young children and their families to play, learn, and grow. So I think that there's a tremendous basis in research and knowledge and understanding of the importance of the early years, the need to strengthen and support families in the early years, and the need to do so in the context of neighborhood with community building strategies that is also emerging into the political and policy world that gives us an opportunity to really take action that will improve health equity and ensure all kids have opportunities for success.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you for kind of setting us up with this great foundation. I'm now going to turn it over to Richard to talk about a state policy in Minnesota specifically.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Angelica, and thanks, Charlie. And on my behalf of my co-authors, Betty Amarita, and from the University of Minnesota, Betty Carlson and Ali G. Vanelli. Hopefully you all have had a chance to at least thumb through the policy plan. It was part of your registration packet. If not, it's available on our website, wilderresearch.org, and I think it will be sent out with this PowerPoint presentation. So in this policy plan, we have articulated a counter-narrative to the usual or dominant pre-K early education narrative. We're hoping it serves as a framework to inspire public policy action. It's really not our policy agenda. It's meant for use by anyone or any group to influence existing policies and to inform new policies so that they're focused on one common goal: healthy child development for all children. And we can do this by nourishing families, communities, and racial equity from the outset. We need to prevent the well-known, persistent, and intolerable education, health, income, and the related inequities before they set in. So this policy plan, its foundation is nearly 20 years deep in prior work and knowledge generated by many people. And you're all likely very familiar with this information, and Charlie referred to some of it. And much of it is actually Minnesota grown. The brain and attachment research by the U of M, Minnesota's Megan Gunner and Ann Masden and Betty Carlson, they've all helped establish that babies and children develop best in safe, stable, and supportive family and community relationships. For babies, it's relationships we must be concerned about, not early education programs. Also, Wilder Research has produced 4 reports on social indicators over the past 10 years, all showing, in Minnesota at least, that African American and American Indian babies trail in every indicator of child well-being, starting with inadequate prenatal care. And the latest of those reports that we did in conjunction with Betty Carlson from the U is our Risk and Reach report. It's a county-by-county look at these indicators, and that's going to actually go live on our Minnesota Compass website this week if you want to take a look at that interactive report. So we have all sorts of research evidence and data, but for this policy framework from the start, more importantly, we got our direction from experiences and voices of more than 50 advisors representing diverse coalition and stakeholders, and voices and choices for children among them, and 360 participants in a dozen listening sessions and community conversations across Minnesota, including families most affected by these inequities. These advisors and community voices, they guided us to our core values, and that includes community self-determination, which means we need to build on the capacity of families and community institutions rather than competing with or displacing them. And we're taking a strength-based approach to child and family development. This means we're treating families and communities as having the wisdom, the experience, the strengths, the determination, and the self-reflection to take charge of their own healing and development, and not treating them as broken, service recipients or as societal burdens. And the key focus on racial equity. If policies that support more of the same and equal access to existing programs, that will not produce equity. That cements inequity in place. If we want all children to thrive, racial equity means children of color, and especially in Minnesota, that means African American and American Indian children. They need relatively more and different types of opportunities, which means it requires a different set of policy priorities than we have now. So in our policy plan, we describe these four interconnected components that basically balance the current emphasis on single, centralized, silo programs, so we can have an equal emphasis on informal social networks and multi-generational relationships, and I'll go into more detail on this in a minute. And then also we have to recognize that family and community economic security are as important for child development as the relationships. When we talk to parents, they want jobs that support their families. And this also connects child development to adequate housing, child care, and transportation. In one of our community conversations, we asked families, some Latino families, what was one of the most important things they needed for healthy child development. They mentioned driver's licenses because they needed to get their kids to child care and they needed to get to work. And as undocumented Minnesotans, they were eligible to have driver's licenses. So having access to driver's license is another key component of this family and community economic security. The third component, which Bharti will actually talk about quite a bit, is having a community-led solutions fund where communities will have access to resources to design and carry out solutions that fit their context. And then we have to have, as Bill has been working on for many years, continuing efforts at integration across systems for silo busting and implementing cross-system solutions. You know, some of that integration could start by enhancing existing children's cabinets and councils. Right now they usually consist of departments of education, health, and human services. What if those councils and decision-making bodies in government also included departments of housing, employment and economic development, public safety, corrections, transportation, basically acknowledging that all parts of state government are concerned about and support healthy child development? That would provide clearer mechanisms. For example, we could look at ways to reduce the impact of criminal justice policies and practices in incarceration on babies, families, and communities. We could promote a more integrated whole family approach to mental health. So not just children's mental health, but adult mental health services, early care and education, home visiting programs, and as Charlie talks about, involving primary care pediatric clinics. It could maybe even extend state and federal home visiting funds, which right now in Minnesota at least are administered in health department, to early Head Start home visiting services, which is located in the education department and doesn't have access to those funds. And we could also improve, for example, access to early screening and early intervention, which is in the education departments, to children under age 3 who are homeless or in foster care served by human services departments. You get the idea. There's a longer list of these sorts of cross-agency solutions that appear in our policy plan. Digging a little bit deeper into the first component about multi-generational relationships. Community members, when they talked about what was working in their communities for healthy child development, they did use terms like, we do have a village. Or actually communities that didn't have a village said they would like a village. They wanted community centers or hubs that could bring families together to support themselves and to learn from each other. They also talked about honoring the value of cultural knowledge and honoring the resilience of families and communities. So this approach would look at policies, state policies, to make sure that support for healthy child development that comes from extended families and social networks as exemplified what doulas provide or what informal caregivers, family friend, and neighbor caregivers provide, those would be valued and sustained, not diminished. Whereas family friend and neighbor caregivers now have sort of gone into hiding because of the emphasis on quality rating of formal programs. Like I say, Bharti is going to talk about this more, but let me just make a few points and give some examples here of what this might do. The key point of this fund, this Community Solutions Fund, is that it will be flexible to best fit different contexts. Also, it would not be limited to evidence-based solutions. Some problems haven't been solved, so there is no evidence to show that they work. In fact, what we would like to do through this effort is to build the evidence base for effective ways to nourish families and communities, to nourish healthy child development for and by racial equity, to build that evidence base. There's some examples that are happening in Minnesota that could benefit from this kind of fund. There's a church in a first-ring suburb. Right now they're taking a multi-generational approach to supporting family, friend, and neighbor caregivers within a Latina cultural context. Or we have the African American Babies Coalition. It has a grassroots Brains Are Built campaign based upon the experiences and words of the African American community. But that needs some sustainable funding to make sure it gets, make sure that brains are built. And last, there's an effort out in another suburban area where it's been largely dominated by a white city council and white school board, by the African Immigrant Services. It's one of the most, it's actually a majority minority community. And they are gaining strength in racial equity work in their Brooklyn Park schools. So these are the sorts of community-based solutions that could get funded through this Community Solutions Fund, which could have a large impact on how children have access for resources for healthy development. So what's different about this approach? So the early childhood narrative and who controls it, that matters. And right now, the early childhood narrative really, it's probably in your states you have the same experience, but really since Race to the Top and its emphasis on early education and quality child care along with the quality rating systems, that child care narrative, that early childhood narrative, has been dominated by those formal systems. And and narrowly so. And so despite all the work that the BUILD initiative has in its past to be comprehensive and to include not just early education, but the importance of health, mental health, family support, and so on, the narrative has become too narrow. And we hope that the words voiced in our policy plan will be a catalyst for and inspire a broader public counter-narrative that shapes the structures of our state systems in concert with those most affected by those systems. And that starts where families are at, expecting the systems to adjust to the families instead of the other way around. So it's strength-based, it's multi-generational, it's multicultural, it's holistic, and we're hoping that it's going to spur policy action to make decisions that help all children, families, and communities thrive. It's an early education narrative focused on opportunity and community self-determination. As Charlie says, it's focused on building social capital and relationships. We think that this focus on early opportunities, relationships, and well-being, rather than on school readiness and early education, can be the start of a transformational narrative and get to the roots of racial equity, built from the voices of communities most affected by those inequities. And with that, it's my transition to Bharti Wari for Voices and Choices for Children Coalition. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and future connections. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. As you mentioned, now we're going to go to our final, but certainly not our least speaker, Bharti.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. And I want to thank the folks at the Learning Collaborative and Wilder for including Voices and Choices in the conversation. I would like to sort of almost say ditto to everything that Charlie and Richard said. Voices and Choices, the Voices and Choices Coalition really came out of the experience that both of them have described. We know, many of us who've been working in the field for a long time understand that inequity isn't siloed either, right? That there is an intersectionality of inequity that plays out for young children and their families. So disparities in housing and in health are not separate from the inequities that happen in education and in other areas. And so we also know that that strong outcomes for families and for parents also lead to strong child outcomes. And so it was really with this understanding and also a real difficulty in watching the system maybe not address the intersectionality of inequity and really robustly supporting strategies that support whole families that Voices and Choices was created. It was started by Melvin Carter, who works in the Office of Early Childhood, and Peggy Flanagan, who was my predecessor here at CDF, now a legislator here in Minnesota. But really, I think from the experience that many advocates of color have found ourselves in, where you may be one or two folks in the context of these rooms and tables in which these decisions are happening, and really can sometimes be effectively either ignored or just find yourself being required to speak for all communities of color, all marginalized people in that room, and finding the experience extremely difficult and challenging personally, but also in terms of really just creating power to create a different kind of narrative, or even getting folks to really look robustly at different kinds of strategies and solutions that will address the inequity that I think both Charlie and Richard spoke of. And so from that, they really brought a group of cross-sector advocates together and to create the Voices and Choices for Children Coalition. And it really has worked with the state councils, our state agencies, early childhood funders, nonprofits, community-based organizations, children's advocates, and parents. Really representing communities of color and American Indian communities to really engage more robustly, to be at the table during these policy conversations, and to really create power, right? How do we organize together to really create a really to amplify the voices of communities of color, to really get people to start changing the way in which public policies that are related to children move forward. We believe that people of color and American Indians must be at the table as policies are created and decisions are made about and for our children. And I think that is one of the critical elements that we have brought to the work that we've been doing over the last several years around early childhood policies. It's how do we sit at the table and ensure that our voice is one that is shaping policy, because it has historically been a voice that has not been at the table. And frankly, we continue to live with deep, deep racial inequities in our community, deep disparities in terms of outcome. And so really feel like it is really the absence of that voice that is a critical component of that, and how do we address that through our coalition. And we have really worked very hard over the last several years. We're a relatively new coalition to really both be strategic in terms of our work, but then also really build on the knowledge that lives within the context of community, and also the knowledge that has been put together by folks like Charlie and Richard. How do we really leverage this information? Because it's not many of us who have been working in the field for a long time have heard these solutions before. Two-generation approaches are not a relatively new concept, right? Building community organizing and building power in the context of community to develop community solutions is not new. But how do we really change the narrative? And so we've worked very strategically to do that. And this year we are really focused on a couple of really key elements that address that have surfaced from coalition and community to really address that. So this year we are going to be sorry, I'm not doing a great job with the slides, but this year we are going to be focused, our legislative priorities are really going to be focused on the Child Care Assistance Program, and which is a two-generation approach for those families that are working to really support kids' access to child care while families are able to get out and work. And to fully fund our basic sliding fee scale, because that is where a lot of working families could use the support, and it is almost out of their reach. We also are trying to support some of the the federal reauthorization here in Minnesota, because we think some of the ways that the federal block grant is, some of the new regulations really does put families in the center of the conversation, so we're supporting that. We are also working really hard to really work with the state around the requirements around Bachelor of Arts requirements in early childhood. Here in Minnesota we have some significant shortages of child care providers. We also really have struggled, particularly in, to Richard's point, in some of our more kindergarten readiness settings, to have a diverse workforce, and we believe that is critical, and so working on that. And then our third policy, legislative piece of our legislative agenda is really this Community Solutions Fund, which I will go into. There are a couple of things I want to sort of add to that conversation. One of the things that we have also found within the context of our coalition is not only the importance and the need for a policy agenda that puts these things forward. I think Richard did an amazing job of laying that out. But I think also Voices and Choices has found itself in the critical role of also doing a great deal of administrative advocacy here in Minnesota, working with our state agencies. Because frankly, inequity and racial disparities are all in the sort of detail of public policy implementation. Oftentimes you may have policies that are trying to get at certain health outcomes, certain outcomes around early childhood, but it is really in the details where things start, where the disparities and where those things start to play out begin to take shape. And so we've done an amazing amount of work working with different state agencies, with different entities, to really think about how the implementation of public policy and where unconscious bias and really frankly the roots of historic, systemic, and structural racism play out in the context of the implementation of these public policies. And it is a different kind of way of advocating. It is not as clean or as sort of tangible as being able to put forth a piece of legislation and then seeing it pass, if you're lucky. And I know that that's a long game. But it's a different kind of way of operating. And I think that's a really critical element when we are thinking about place, race, and early childhood outcomes to think about. So I just wanted to make that point before I moved forward. I think Richard did a great job of setting up our Community Solutions Fund for Healthy Child Development. And to Richard's point, both in his report, in some reports that were put together by the Voices and Choices Coalition a couple of years back, really the community really said what they would like to see is an opportunity for community itself to direct how resources move through our system. Richard illuminated a number of initiatives that are doing some amazing work that are both culturally competent and relevant in their approach in strategy and intervention that really could use additional resources, but are oftentimes left at the margin of those kinds of programs that receive resources, either through private philanthropy or through state funding. And so that was sort of the impetus for this Community Solutions Fund for Healthy Child Development. And it really is about communities needing flexible access to flexible funding, right, to build the evidence, as Richard had said. Many programs have not been formally evaluated, and it makes it difficult for them to be able to talk about their work from an evidence-based perspective. And not that evidence and evaluation aren't critical, but I also want to sort of point out that some of those, it takes money to evaluate programs. And if these are programs that are under-resourced, evaluation is and rigorous evaluation in the way that it has historically been understood is a challenging thing for community programs to be able to pull together. The Community Solutions Fund for Healthy Child Development represents more than just money. It represents the recognition that community itself has valuable knowledge. to Richard's point, that this isn't a group this community isn't a group of folks that are broken and need to be fixed, or folks that are not paying attention or not seriously caring about the issues they have, but that community has knowledge and has historically been ignored. And that that community must be active and valued participants in the creation of solutions that are ultimately going to impact them. We in Minnesota have deep, deep disparities that have played out for decades, and it is through greater putting the hands of actual dollars into the hands of community that we would like to sort of see if we can't change that narrative. The state must increase its support of early childhood of children of color and American Indian children, prenatal to 3rd grade. We also know that our systems have historically been very siloed, not just in terms of service provision, but this subset of our community or our systems work with kids 0 to 3. This group works with kids 3 to 5. This group works with kids even older. And frankly, I don't know that those separations are very meaningful to community members themselves. And how do we get our systems to be thinking about children and their development across several age ranges or stages of life is one of the critical pieces of our Community Solutions Fund. Each community is unique and will require different solutions to move forward. And really, we want to create the space in terms, and space is often created with money and resource, right? To really source resource innovation within the context of community itself, to really support and invest in creativity and knowledge, and that is community-based and driven. So to address this, we are moving forward. We want to establish a Community Solutions Fund that will really help families and community move forward. We are working in partnership with we would like to establish a Community Solutions Fund for Healthy Child Development and administered by the Minnesota Department of Health in consultation with the Community Solutions Fund Advisory Council. Oops, I'm sorry. And really working where community and our state agency would be really working very closely together in terms of getting resources and funds out. Last year, the state of Minnesota worked hard to really think about some of the economic disparities in our community and really provide resources that might help that. What we would like them to do is to really think about the deep racial disparities and early childhood, because we think that that is a critical piece. So through the Community Solutions Fund for Healthy Child Development, we want to it would really allow us to really have community-led opportunities for getting resources out the door, not just here in our urban core, but across the state of Minnesota. And the purposes of those funds will really be improve child well-being as it is understood within the context of our communities, within the context of a more holistic understanding of that. And I think that is all that I have to say for right now.
Thank you, Bharti. Thank you for really bringing it to life. I think it's great to kind of really see what on-the-ground work looks like. Before we get to your questions, I'm just going to open it up to Charlie, and he's going to really kind of give us a conclusion on opportunities for synergy with other activities in the field.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Angelica, and thank you everyone for being in on this call, and particularly to Bharti and Richard. I just think that right now we're at a time where we have an opportunity to really press forward on it's not either or. It's not either providing professional public services or building community ties and responses at the neighborhood level and working from an asset-based perspective with families to help them develop their future and the future of their kids. But it is both and. And so this is a list of just a number of things that are in the work, and we constantly find different up that are, in many senses, working to reinvent common sense, that if you want to succeed with young children in the context of their families, you have to work with families, not to or for them, and that families really have a lot of the solutions if they're given the time, space, and opportunity to come together. So I think that there are many others, but I think that one of the great things about the piece that was put out is it really puts this in a policy context. The Minnesota piece puts it in a policy context, and the voices and choices really is, people talk about authentic engagement, but it really is an explicit effort to create that table where people can come together to express what they want for their communities. So I have one quick question for Bharti myself, is if you could just explain a little bit more about who is on Voices and Choices as far as the membership and what types of constituencies they represent.
Sure. So the membership, as I said, the membership of Voices and Choices is really a cross-sector group. I mean, we've got funders, we have people who work in our K-12 system, we have folks who work in early childhood education, we have folks that are sort of situated in either community health or in sort of more traditional medical settings and clinical settings. So it is really very truly a cross-sector group of folks from Head Start who are really very concerned about children of color. I will say that the leadership of our coalition is exclusively people of color. So we have also a steering committee that is made of people of color who help to really guide and make some critical decisions, but our coalition is a really buy-in for people of color, although we do have many allies in the room as well, and really also includes parents. Many of us who are in the coalition are parents ourselves, but really want to have representation of parents that really are just there for their kids, right? They're not really tied to this in a professional way that many of us are. But really, I think the origins of our coalition really started because there have been advocates of color saying these things for a very long time. I've been listening to one of Richard's colleagues, Betty Amarita, for many years, and I have so much respect for her. But really, there have been many of us who have been saying these things for a very long time, right? And really, I think the wisdom of Peggy Flanagan and Melvin Carter was really good. How do we amplify those voices? Because many of us are just one voice at many of these state tables in many national conversations. So how do we do that? And so that's where our organizing started first, and then really working to really authentically engage parents. And the constituencies behind many of the folks that are at our table are specific neighborhoods, are different African American, American Indian, immigrant groups that are really that many of our advocates represent, but then are also just at the table as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Bharti, for that. Let's now go to some of the questions we have in our chat box. Well, one of them was more of a comment, and basically their comment was, would love to see informal learning institutions such as libraries to be included and informed by this work. And I don't know if anybody wants to talk about the role of other players that could be in this role, in this work.
I think that often libraries are, there are growing a number of family place libraries which really do focus upon being gathering spots for families and creating activities and opportunities. And if libraries are located in neighborhoods, they generally do offer that meeting space, that point of contact where people can get to, where it's safe and supportive. In many of the poor neighborhoods, the libraries that do exist may be smaller and they may have less overall access, but it's certainly one of those institutions that is something that should be a part of people's lives. I mean, I take for granted the library in my own community, and I think that libraries have a responsibility to be culturally and linguistically responsive and representative as well. So I think the point of having libraries involved, the point of having all of those on-the-ground institutions, but I think what Richard and Bharti both said things around, are there also cultural institutions and cultural centers or family resource centers that also represent those natural, safe, secure gathering points for families and kids.
Thank you. Our next question is for Richard. You mentioned that you heard from families. Did you conduct a survey, interviews, community walk, etc.? And was it a statewide or within a smaller community?
Yeah, we had 12 open, we called them listening sessions. And 2 of those were sponsored by, one was sponsored by Wilder and one was sponsored by the U of M. The other, if you look at the back of our report, you can see we partnered with community organizations, community-based organizations in diverse communities, and then also in rural parts of Minnesota. And they did the open invitations to those sessions, and which included really anyone who wanted to attend. But some were strictly just families working. They worked with the center. Some included teens and grandparents along with the parents. We had almost 90 people at one of the sessions sponsored by the African Immigrant Services. So they were lively discussions.
Thank you. This question is regarding some of the statistics, and basically, does the Hispanic number include illegal immigrant families?
Yes, it does. I mean, it includes the data that I provided was census data, which includes households. Saying that, we know that there's an undercount of certain populations in the census. And actually, one of the biggest undercounts is in young children, who live in families that are particularly struggling and particularly likely to be in poor neighborhoods. But yeah, this did include residents.
Thank you. This question is for Bharti. Bharti, you mentioned advocating for no mandatory BA degree requirements for early childhood teachers. The state of Vermont went the complete other direction and recently required teachers to have a BA degree to improve quality of teachers. Expected impact? What is your reasoning for not requiring a BA degree?
I knew that was going to be the most controversial thing I said today. So here's what I will say. I will say, first of all, Voices and Choices is incredibly supportive of anybody going after an advanced degree. We are not in any way saying that that is not an absolutely worthy thing. I think there are a couple of things that make us very concerned and sort of advocating against that. Number one, even in our K-12 system, but pre-K system, but certainly in our early childhood systems, frankly, there's not enough money, and the business model is incredibly challenging for the system itself to support these kinds of advanced degrees. So until we are, as a state, willing to support and really fully invest in early childhood programs and opportunities, this would be really difficult. Number two, it also represents for us, we would challenge the assumption that our systems of our institutions of higher education are able to sort of really address and adequately prepare those folks that to work with students of color. I know that there have been certainly great steps made, but the fact of the matter is that we assume that a BA requirement equals quality. And it may in some levels, but I don't know that that necessarily means that a BA requirement or having that will mean you can work with a diverse group of students really and be able to address that. Number 3, we know that historically people of color have not really been able to access higher education in the ways that others haven't. And we are very concerned that a BA requirement would actually lead to less diversity of our workforce. We can see that in our K-12 situation here in Minnesota, and I think that that is what makes us hesitant. We would be very supportive of BA requirements if the state and if our other institutions would really create supports, not just for maybe American Indian teachers or teachers of color, but actually for teachers in greater Minnesota too, where this would also represent a challenge from a geographic standpoint of view. So that's sort of the reasoning that we've had. We are very concerned that a BA requirement would really create a situation in which we would have a less diverse workforce in early childhood. And right now it is better than our K-12 system, at least here in Minnesota, and we would like to maintain that and grow that, in fact, if we can.
Thank you. We have a question for Bharti. Bharti talked about the goal of Community Solutions for Children Fund. Where does the proposal currently stand? Are you advocates hopeful that it will be established in the near future?
Yes, actually, I mean, the 2017 legislative session really for us represents the first time we're going to be going out with that piece of legislation. Richard has been actually very involved in the development of that proposal, but it's kind of our first time out with it, and we're pretty excited. I mean, this particular strategy has come up in the listening sessions Richard and Wilder has done. It came up in listening sessions that CDF and Voices and Choices for Children have put together, and we think it's time. We also think that the state has made some investments in terms of thinking about disparities and equity with regards to income and economic stability, and we think that there may be some appetite for us to do that here in early childhood. So that's where we're at, and we're sort of interested in seeing. We just wrote the legislation up recently, and are looking for authors or in that process. So we're very excited about this, but it really represents for us a new strategy to go after. So maybe there'll be another chance to update the folks on the call at some later date.
And I think one thing that I was going to say, Richard, that one of the experiences that Minnesota's had has been to support community solutions, sometimes around more specific concerns, but I know that there were a lot of investments made that were very successful in supporting family, friend, and neighbor caregiving within communities. If you wanted to speak a little to that. When kids are very young, 0 to 2, frankly, they're not in formal child care arrangements by and large. Mm-hmm. They're primarily either in their parents' care or in care of someone who is providing care for them as a grandparent, aunt, relative, or close friend. And I think that Minnesota did substantial work to say, how can we support those family, friend, and neighbor caregivers so that they really provide the type of care that the kids can most benefit from?
We were the first legislature to pass funding for to support family, friend, and neighbor care efforts and sort of pilot projects around the state. But that was 8 years ago, and since then, with the emphasis on, I mean, because it's such an effort to get enough places rated as high quality in order to place kids, 3- and 4-year-olds, into quality care, that most of the energy is going into that effort, and there's not a lot of, I mean, family, friend, and neighbor caregivers are still eligible for some of that support, but they're not a priority. And with the new federal rules and the requirements to have access to public subsidies to be registered to get those, it's going to be fewer and fewer family-friendly neighbor caregivers that are having access to resources. So until we fully realize that kids 2 and younger are either at home with their mother or primarily with their mother or their grandmother for the most part, that's where they are, and so we need to, funneling resources to that if we expect those little brains to be developing. And we think, babies are purple is probably not a good image to have, since that sounds like they're choking on something. But it's truly, we got to figure out how to make clear that babies are, in fact, neither Republicans or Democrats, but they're actually, they need to be nurtured, and the way to do that is to support their families and communities.
Thank you, Richard. Before I ask the next question, I just want to, there was a comment, and this is just for us as how important language is, but to make sure that when we're talking about the Hispanic community, we use the word undocumented versus illegal, and, I do apologize for that, but, the language is important, so thank you for that participant who pointed that out. So
I think I said
let me
undocumented.
I think there's a comment earlier, question earlier, but this is a question for everyone here, and this is really mostly about supporting women. And the question is, have any communities you work with designate solutions around economic development for women? Have any communities designed women-led and supportive communities such as co-working space with child care, women's business, entrepreneur groups, or any other ideas that include social support and businesses with women? Any of the work done around?
Don't know.
Well, I think when we look at who's caring for our young children, it is either moms, many of whom are working, and some dads, or child care, family support workers, people in family resource centers, and family-friendly neighbor care providers, which, as Richard said, a lot of them are grandmothers. That a lot of those are women. Women are disproportionately the workers and the caregivers. And I think one of the strategies is to enhance the reimbursement for that care, and that will provide some support at the same time creating career opportunities. But I do think that a lot of the work that goes on when one develops resources at the community level and it's focused around young children, community solutions end up being around family resource centers. They end up being around co-op activities for kids. They end up being around new programs and practice in libraries. They end up being around how do we create culturally responsive childcare. And all of those end up, as I said, disproportionately the people who are going to be doing that work and employed are going to be women. I also think that we really do obviously have to look at how we have roles for men in their kids' lives.
Thank you. I think this is a question.
There's one thing I would add to that. Just here in Minnesota, I know that our Department of Economic something other E
and Economic Development.
Thank you, Richard. Has been looking at the workforce issue, and I think primarily understanding that there's a gendered lens to that. I'm not really quite sure where that will land, right? But I think that they have been. That I know that that's some work that has sort of floated across my desk and some others in terms of just understanding what does this workforce look like. If you add a gendered lens to that, what that could potentially look like. I don't know where it's going to go, but I think at least it's in the air.
Great. Thank you. We have about 5 minutes, and there's a couple more questions I'm going to get through before we close this. One of them I think is more for Richard and Bharti, and it's how much are you asking for to fund the Community Solutions Fund relative to the ask for CCDBG increases? How do you balance the priorities? Are your advocate partners on board with both asks?
I think the ask is,
Richard?
isn't it $10 million a year for
Yes.
years? Yeah.
Yes.
The last proposal I saw was actually to do a planning year.
Yep.
And then to have full implementation over 2 years with $10 million implementation per year.
Yep. That's correct, Richard.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And could you say the second half of that question? I'm sorry.
No, basically, how do you balance the priorities? Are your advocacy partners on board with both asks?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think yes. I mean, I don't know. I'll let Richard answer too. But the fact of the matter is that there's. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I think Richard's point about kids being purple. I mean, the fact of the matter is this is the most important time. And we spend a lot of time and resources mitigating issues that could be addressed early on. And if we can resource our community, either through a community health a solutions fund that is focused on healthy development, whether it is supporting the regulations in the block grant that help create more stable child care opportunities for families, the fact of the matter is we need all of the above. We have too many kids that are struggling. We have too many families that are struggling and are living on the margins. And so I think many of us, I mean, as much as folks like to make it a zero-sum game, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we have to have a vision for our communities, and we have to have the will to change the narrative, right? Or we will continue to have the deep disparities we do. And if we advocates ourselves are not going to really push our legislative partners, our state partners, and ourselves to think more expansively, I don't know how we ever have a different set of circumstances for kids.
Prior to the last election, especially last legislative session, there was quite a bit of emphasis on discussion about the importance of racial equity, and especially when it came to economic disparities with the census coming out, and so there was money put into economic development, and I think so. There's an appetite to do something, and I think the whole point is that we can keep throwing money later on after the problems are there and the inequities are there, and it's so hard to close those gaps once they grow. So if we want to get to the roots of racial equity, that's where you start prenatally, and that's sort of the basic message of the plan. Someone wanted to know it was the amount of money. It was $5 million the first year and $10 million each year for the next 2 years. So it was, I think, $25 million total. Right, Bharti?
Yep, that sounds right, Richard. I wasn't sure about the planning year money, but yeah.
Great. Thank you. And I think I have time for one more question and just a quick answer, but are you addressing early childhood mental health services?
Definitely. But we'd like to see it viewed within a holistic context. So it's, it's with in coordination with maternal mental health and adult mental health. And then how do you give resources to caregivers to deal with that as well? So it's really an integrated approach, a holistic, whole family integrated approach to children's mental health. Yes, but definitely. I think what we've learned that early education alone is not going to produce school readiness. You really have to have comprehensive approaches, health, mental health, economic development, if we really want to close the readiness gap, and to really want to prevent it to begin with, you really have to include all that early on.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to everyone, all our participants and our speakers. And just this last slide really talks about some additional resources. You can find them at the Child and Family Policy website, cfpciowa.org. Thank you very much for participating. And we'll be sending some information out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Please stand by.